So this is a kind of theme in lots of the stuff that I've published in the last few years. I think that if you take a theistic or deistic worldview and elaborate it in detail, set it against a naturalistic worldview, like the one that I adopt, that's also set out in detail, and you compare them, it will turn out that the naturalistic view is more virtuous than the theistic or deistic view. At any rate, that will be my judgment. I mean, I allow that maybe you could have rational disagreement about this, and so I'm not saying that what I've just said is going to persuade everybody that they should be naturalists, but that's how I see it. I think that the best total view that you can come up with is one that doesn't include anything beyond, at least as far as the kind of causal reality goes, it's just natural reality. So there are no gods.
The arguments from phenomena to God are cumulative. Each phenomenon gives some degree of probability to the hypothesis. Taken together with arguments from phenomena against the existence of God, they give an overall probability to the existence of God. I've argued at length elsewhere that overall, these arguments, all the ones starting from all sorts of phenomena for and from all sorts of phenomena against, overall, these arguments make the existence of God significantly more probable than not.
All right, welcome everyone to a very special event today. So I'm very honored to have with me Professor Graham Oppy, I guess this way, and Professor Richard Swinburne, who will be talking about the probability of theism, that God exists. And in particular, they'll be focusing on some of Professor Swinburne's arguments that theism is very probably true. While they probably need little introduction, Dr. Oppy is Professor of Philosophy at Monash University. Dr. Swinburne is Professor Emeritus at Oxford University, and they have both written extensively, have a variety of books and other publications, primarily on the philosophy of religion and related topics. So before I get into it, thanks so much for being here, Graham and Richard. All right.
You want me?
Yes. Yeah, we're just going to just talk about the format here first. So today's session is going to be about 90 minutes, and it's going to be largely an open discussion between Dr. Swinburne and Dr. Oppy. The topic is the probability of theism, as I said. Already it's going to focus on some of Dr. Swinburne's arguments that theism is very probably true. And he's going to start with a roughly 15-minute presentation making his case, after which they'll turn to open discussion. There will be a question time at the end. Feel free to make questions and put questions in the YouTube chat. I'll try to read them all. Some preference will go to super chats. I see some have come in already, but yeah, with that, thanks so much for being here. And Richard, feel free to begin when you're ready.
Okay. I believe that there's a God because I believe the existence of God provides the best and most probably true explanation of the most general features of the universe. I mean by God an essentially everlasting, omnipotent being. The most general features on which I build my case are first simply that there is a very large physical universe. Secondly, that it is law-governed by very simple and almost entirely deterministic laws. Thirdly, that those laws are such as to, with the initial conditions of the universe, bring about the existence of human bodies. And fourthly, that those human bodies are the bodies of conscious, living beings who have thoughts, purposes, beliefs, and desires. the criteria for an explanation being a probable explanation of phenomena are these. A hypothesis H makes evidence evidence E makes a hypothesis H probable if and only if, firstly, H makes E not too improbable. That is to say, if the hypothesis is true, you would expect, with some reasonable probability, the evidence. Secondly, if the hypothesis is false, you wouldn't expect the evidence. Not H makes E much less probable. And thirdly, it must be a simple hypothesis. I can illustrate these criteria at work with a simple example from forensics. Suppose there's been a theft. Money has been stolen from a safe. The detective has a hypothesis that John robbed the safe. What evidence does he have to produce for it? Well, he has to show that John was in a position to rob the safe and the sort of person who might have been expected to do so. Secondly, he has to show that if John hadn't robbed the safe, there's no reason to suppose anybody else had done, and that no reason to suppose that the safe would have been robbed at all. Thirdly, and this is the crucial one, simplicity. Now, if the first two criteria were enough, if it was enough to show that a hypothesis was made probable by evidence, if the evidence was such that the hypothesis predicted it, which you wouldn't get otherwise, that wouldn't do, because suppose John is brought to court for this crime, and his barrister, his lawyer, says there's a very easy explanation of why the crime took place. This was that some unknown person, other than John, robbed the safe, and that the reason why I'm sorry, let's go back again. Suppose the hypothesis is that John robbed the safe, and the detective has certain kinds of evidence for it. His evidence is that John was seen near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed, and that his fingerprints were found on the safe, and that money equivalent to the sum stolen was found in his house. If John robbed the safe, you would expect to find these clues. That is to say, you'd expect to find that he was around at the time, and that his fingerprints might well be left on the safe, and that his money might well be found in his house. And you wouldn't expect to find these things, let us suppose, otherwise. So, the hypothesis that he robbed the safe satisfies the criteria that if the hypothesis is true, you would find the evidence, and if it is false, there is no reason to suppose you would. But when John is accused of the crime, his lawyer says, oh, well, there's another simple explanation of this. Somebody else did the robbery, but quite unknown to the somebody else, a different person, George, dressed up to look like John and be around the robbery scene at the time. And a third person, wishing to pin the crime on John, a third person, James, got hold of John's fingerprints with a certain device and put them on the safe. And by quite accident, a fourth thief put the money from a different robbery into John's house. Now, if all that rather complicated hypothesis was true, you would expect to find the evidence, and if it was not true, you wouldn't. But you don't count that as a very probable hypothesis. for the reason that it's a very complicated hypothesis. Whereas the hypothesis that John did say is the hypothesis that one person is responsible for all the evidence, whereas the arrival hypothesis says that four people acting in quite unconnected ways produce the evidence, and therefore that is far less simple. So simplicity is crucial, and it's crucial in science too. You can always devise very complicated hypotheses that will explain any data you find. You can always devise an infinite number of them, but the hypothesis is only going to be likely to be true if it is a simple hypothesis. Now, in the case of God, the evidence to which I have drawn your attention, that evidence is necessary for the existence of human beings. That is to say, there wouldn't be human beings unless there was a physical universe, unless it was governed largely by simple laws, because if there weren't simple laws, humans wouldn't know how to make a difference to the world. They wouldn't know that if you sowed seeds, you could grow food, or if you set light to crops, that would deprive your enemies of food. Humans need bodies through which to act on the world and through which to know about it. And of course, they also have to be conscious. So this is all necessary for the existence of humans. If there is a God, all powerful and all good, obviously he could make human beings. Why should he do so? Well, because human beings are a good thing. We are good things. We have feelings and thoughts and can make a difference to the world and enjoy ourselves and help other people and so on and so forth. But above all, we have a choice between doing good and doing evil, making the world different for good or for evil. That is a kind of goodness that even God does not have, for God can do no evil. So, God has reason to create beings who have limited powers, who can not merely do what he wants, but choose whether to do the good and love God or reject the good. So there is good reason to suppose he might make us. There is no reason to suppose that the world would be like that if it hadn't been created, because after all, why should there be an enormous number of physical bodies? Furthermore, if there are, why should they all behave in exactly the same way? Actually the same simple way, being governed by largely simple laws. But to say they're governed by largely simple laws is just to say they all behave in the same way. And that would be an enormous coincidence if it were true. Again, even if they are governed by simple laws, why should those laws be such as to lead to the evolution of human bodies? Because most of the possible laws by which the universe might be governed will not have that property, will not lead to the evolution of human bodies. Laws have to have very particular kinds of characteristics in order to do this. They have to be fine-tuned to start with, but not only that, but more generally, for example, unless quantum theory were true, there wouldn't be any stability in atoms, and unless the Pauli exclusion principle was true, you couldn't have the simple elements building up into the more complicated elements that you needed for human life, and so on and so forth. And finally, of course, God is a very simple being. He is just one being. He is simple in that the only property necessary for his existence is one property, omnipotence, everlasting omnipotence, that is, essential everlasting omnipotence. And omnipotence is the ability to do everything, which is the having zero limits to his power, and zero is a very simple number, much more simple than 20, the power to make a universe of such and such a size, but not a bigger one. Therefore, it's a very simple explanation of why these general features hold. They hold primarily for our sake, to give us the opportunity to grow, to make a difference to things, and that's a very good thing. That is the basic structure of my argument.
All right. So I guess if you, very good. Thanks so much for that, Professor Swinburne. So if you two want to move to a sort of open discussion, take it from there. If you're,
well, I want to hear from Graham now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to just start by asking some questions, and then I guess people from the audience will also join in and ask some questions as well. So I have a sort of different kinds of questions that I'd like to ask. I want to start with a couple of questions about the kind of ambition that you have for the argument, or the purpose that you think that it serves. So in particular, I'm wondering what you think the argument achieves and for whom. So there's a range of views that you might have. So at one extreme, you might think that what the argument shows is that it's rationally permissible for you and people like you to believe that God exists. At another extreme, you might think what the argument's going to show is that it's rationally obligatory for everyone to believe that God exists. And I wondered where on this kind of spectrum you actually sit.
Oh, I think it's rational for everyone, because science is rational for everyone, and I am appealing to the most general features which a scientist uses to assess hypotheses. Those criteria I've mentioned are central to science. If you think, for example, that Newton's theory, when it was produced, was a very probably true theory. Why was it? Well, because it makes a lot of data about astronomy and the behavior of mechanical bodies on Earth pretty probable. H makes E to be expected. And there's no other reason. If there was any other set of laws governing it, or it was chaos, then you wouldn't have these astronomical and mechanical phenomena. And it is a very simple theory. There are just the three laws of motion and the law of gravitational attraction, which uses only one property, the mass of a thing, and a simple relation between the masses of a thing, that is to say, an inverse square relation. The number 2 is a very simple number. It's the only number that appears in the law. This is a very simple theory. And yet, the data, as far as explaining the data is concerned, innumerable theories could have done that. I mean, you could have a theory like Newton's up till yesterday, and then but containing another term which had the value 0 until the galaxies were a certain distance apart, and then suppose they're that distance apart yesterday, in which case that theory would make entirely different predictions for what happened tomorrow. But of course that theory would be more complicated. So these are the criteria science uses. People ought to use the same criteria when judging a theistic hypothesis, which is only a meta-scientific hypothesis, or yet more general scientific hypothesis.
Okay, so maybe I can ask the question a slightly different way. So not long after you published the first edition of The Existence of God, where an argument of this kind is set out in more detail, John Mackie published a book, The Miracle of Theism, in which he more or less runs exactly the same kind of argument on exactly the same data, and it reaches exactly the opposite conclusion. So are you saying that Mackie was just kind of crazy, irrational, to go through and make his assessment of the case and arrive at a completely different position? Right. That's what I meant by the, who. So should Mackie, were Mackie here now and he heard what you just said, what he should say is, of course, Richard, you're right about everything. I'm a theist now.
Well, we could go through Mackie's text line by line, of course, and I would find certain places where I think he's gone wrong, and then I would argue with him that, our basic understanding of scientific method and so on suggests he's made a mistake here, and that is what I would do. But of course, there are certain things that I didn't say in the first edition, and I felt the need to say because of things other people have said subsequently. I mean, you, among other people, have drawn attention to, with regard to the fine-tuning, and just to explain to the audience what that is, scientific laws, but just take Newton's law as one example. This is the law of gravity, and it shows the forces, the gravitational forces, which act between bodies. And it states this in terms of the gravity, that the force is equal to g, the gravitational constant, times the product of the masses of two bodies divided by the square of their distance apart. Now, if that gravitational constant had a value very much bigger or very much smaller than that, you wouldn't get the fine-tuning. And again, if you need not merely the laws to be fine-tuned, but the initial condition of the universe to be fine-tuned, and that's the Big Bang. And if the Big Bang had gone off a bit bigger, there wouldn't be any planets for people to live on. And if the Big Bang had gone off a bit smaller, all the matter would be squashed together. So constants have to have particular values. And you have pointed out that there are certain problems there. To start with, you can measure things like masses and things like that and their relations to each other by a formula, but you can put the formula in a different way so that it looks a lot more complicated than the way I've stated it. For example, you could define a constant d, which is some complicated relation of if we measured mass in a different way than simply in terms of kilograms, and if we had a measuring scale that counted what we count as 1 kilogram as 2 units, and what we count as 2 kilograms as 6 units, and these units are unrelated to each other, then it would be a rather complicated formula which would describe the same public behavior. But why should we choose one way of expressing the formula rather than a different way? And how you express it means whether it's a simple formula or not a simple formula. And in that case, what comes back is if you express it in a somewhat complicated way, it will be the case that it's not at all improbable that the gravitational constant would have the value it does, because the area within the region, the range within which it's allowed to vary while we still have human life, is a range of g, but if it could be a range of a different constant, although one related to g in some way, and it could be expressed in a more complicated way. And if it was expressed in a more complicated way, then that constant could be allowed to vary a lot without upsetting human life. I'm sorry, this isn't very easy to explain without a bit of paper, but I think most people will have got the point with luck. Well, that's true, but simplicity is evidence of truth, and we judge that Newton's law is the right law, and we make the judgment as to which is the right law on the basis of the simplest formulation of that law. And the simplest formulation is the one that Newton gave. And therefore, as it were, the thing at work is the gravitational constant measured in the way it is measured, because it's on that basis that we adopt Newton's theory at all, viz. That its simplest formulation is simple. And therefore, it's that constant's varying which would make all the difference. And therefore, it's reasonable to suppose that it's the range within which that constant varies compared with the possible range of values of the constant that we ought to consider. And that is very small and therefore very unlikely to happen by chance. So point I'm making is simply I didn't work through that for the first edition, but I have done so certainly, and there are other things that is the case. But nevertheless, neither I or Mackie are perfectly rational beings, and we have, as it were, advanced reason for going for one hypothesis rather than another. We all like not to be shown wrong, and we all like not to be shown that things we've lived by for many years are all mistaken, and our view on life has got to change. That would make a great difference to our friendships and way of life. So we've all got, both of us got irrational reasons, and that explains differences. But the fact that we differ is just the same fact as scientists often differ on the same data. They certainly have done on cosmology. And yeah, we've just got to live by that and try and show that the other one is mistaken or not, either by showing that the other side hasn't fully taken account of the data, or by waiting for some new data. But there's not very likely to be some new data in this area, so we must concentrate on arguments as to whether he or I have rightly articulated the criteria and rightly applied them to the evidence.
Right. Sorry. Okay, there's an echo. There's an echo at my end, which is a bit distracting. So, given the last thing that you said, so I want to move on to something else, but I thought I should at least finish off this initial sort of question about ambition and purpose. So it seems as though you kind of walked away a bit at the end from saying, well, look, what the argument shows is that Mackie's just irrational, right? Because you kind of, what you said is we're both fallible. There might be all kinds of mistakes in your argument, so that it's perfectly proper for Mackie not to be persuaded by it, right? And it, of course, you think that Mackie's wrong, but you might not be able to pinpoint exactly. I mean, there's another sort of thought. You might not be able to pinpoint exactly where you think that Mackie goes so dramatically wrong. So you might think that what you said at the end there was that, look, in the end, there's going to be, as with lots of philosophical questions, there's going to be lots of matters for judgment. And when we make philosophical judgments, it's kind of imprudent to suppose that everybody who disagrees with us is irrational, just sort of all over the place. That seems like a kind of hubris that nobody would want to adopt.
No, I'm not supposing that at all. We can all make mistakes, and we can all correct our mistakes. And if you and I went through the text of Mackie's book, The Miracle of Theism, I would be able to point out places where I think he's gone wrong and give you an argument why he's gone wrong.
And Mackie would have did the same for the existence of theism, right? He went through
sure,
to lots of places where he thought you'd gone wrong and he gave reasons why. I mean, that's just the nature of philosophy.
Well, so it is, yes, and it's not just philosophy, as I say, it's the nature of science, and certainly in much disputed fields, and physical cosmology is scientific physical cosmology is a much disputed field, and different people put forward different theories on the basis of the same evidence, and they think that they do better justice to the evidence, and they give their reason, and the other side gives their reason. I mean, originally there was a great dispute between steady state theory and expanding universe theory, and one side said the universe always remains basically the same. From new matter is created, but it's created between the old matter, and things stay roughly, galaxies remain roughly the same way, the distance away from the next galaxy, whereas the expanding universe says the distance between galaxies expanded. Well, each side can give their reasons, they can go on giving their reasons. Often they may convince the other side. I like to think people change their views as a result of my sort of argument. Maybe Mackie doesn't, but other people do.
Mackie may well like to think that people change their minds as a result of his argument.
Yes, of course. Yes, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. So that was a kind of purpose question. The next question that I wanted to ask about is a sort of framing question. So broadly speaking, the case that you make is framed in Bayesian terms.
Yep.
And you might wonder whether, given the subject matter and so on, it would be better to frame it slightly differently from the way that you do. So the way that you do it, you take your hypothesis and you ask how probable it is on the evidence. You might wonder whether you shouldn't rather use a kind of odds version of Bayes' theorem and take the competing hypotheses and weigh them together, right? So you've got what you really want to do is, it's not sort of a hypothesis, there's theories on both sides, and what you want to do is to determine which of the theories does better on the total evidence. So shouldn't you actually be thinking about a kind of odds version here where you've got a competing hypothesis? Let's go with Mackie's naturalism as the competing view. We imagine that we elaborate the view and your view to the same level of detail, and then we look to see how they fare when we sort of plug in the Bayesian formula, so that we've got the theories against which we can assess the likelihoods. We've got the theories so that we can look to the priors, we can assess the simplicity of the theories, and so on. So I wonder what you thought about that.
Well, in effect, that's what I'm doing, because my second criterion for a probable scientific theory is that if my hypothesis was false, you wouldn't expect the data. But if it were the case that a rival hypothesis was equally good at explaining the data, then mine wouldn't satisfy my second criterion. And in effect, I am saying, look, the alternatives are either that there's a less powerful or a lot of less powerful beings in charge of the universe, polytheism or weak God, but those are firstly not a simple hypotheses. If they postulate many, or if they postulate a weaker God, then they are postulating a God with the power to create a universe of this size but not a universe of that size, and so on. And that is less simple than the hypothesis of omnipotence. So they get ruled out on that grounds. And then the alternative, Mackie type alternative, is that the laws of nature are ultimate. That is what naturalism is committed to. And but what does that mean? That means that there isn't anything that makes it the case that each atom behaves in the same way. You may say, well, there's a law that makes it, but how can a law make something the case? Laws are it's difficult to make sense of that. But even if you could make sense of that, the question then would arise as to why it's this law, or rather, to go back one step, laws by themselves don't make any difference to things. They only make a difference to things when there are initial states of the universe on which they operate and lead to further states. So the question then arises as to why the initial state of the universe, or if it doesn't have one, its boundary conditions of some sort, are such that the laws are such as to lead to us. And you can't, if you say, well, it's the boundary conditions, there's always been a universe, well, all the same, there are certain conditions, certain features the universe has to have other than that it behaves in accordance with the laws of nature. If the laws are to produce us, for example, even if they were the same laws of nature but only 4 atoms, we wouldn't evolve. The material of the universe has to have a lot of other detail in it if we are to evolve. But I can't make sense, even so, of the laws just operating on their own. It seems to me the obvious way of describing this situation is to say that all the atoms behave in the same way, and laws simply state that. And one reason why I think that is the preferable way of stating it is that that's the only way to make sense of our behavior. We cause things. I cause the motion of my arm. It's not that a state of me operated on by some law causes the motion of my arm. And so we have to have the notion of an agent making a difference to things, a substance, me, making a difference to things. And in that case, if you postulated that laws make a difference to the inanimate world, but we make a difference to the non-animate world, that would introduce a very great complexity into our understanding of the universe, and therefore it's preferable to take a view that the causation in the universe is a causation by things. It's lumps of matter which cause the motion of other lumps of matter. It's not laws that make lumps of matter cause the motion of other laws of matter. So for all these reasons, I think the other hypotheses are more complicated than mine.
Right, so it wouldn't hurt at this point to look at in detail at an alternative hypothesis about the history of the universe. So I'm going to start with what's a toy model, and then I'll explain why it's a toy model. So let's suppose that the universe starts with singularity. So there's a point.
Sorry, I can't say again.
The universe starts with a singularity. There's an initial point, and it's characterized by a couple of quantities, mass and temperature, and they're both infinite. And the thing has a disposition to evolve. So this is what you've got. Now, in that state, there aren't innumerable particles. There aren't any particles.
No.
Right? And then, so there is going to be another bit to this, which has to do with the disposition to evolve. I mean, you suggest elsewhere that really when you're talking about laws, somehow or other what's kind of the metaphysics of it is that there are powers. So I'm just going to suppose that this thing, which is characterized by two infinite quantities, simple, and one power just to evolve. And if we move to talking about laws, so as a description of the powers, what happens is that as the thing expands, because that was the third thing, it has this disposition to expand, as it expands, you get certain transitions, which are physical transitions in which you get, for example, the production of particles. And it's just straightforwardly a matter of the powers or the laws, whichever way you're thinking about it, that the particles, there's a small number of particles, and when you've got a particle of a certain kind, it just comes out possessing certain essential quantities. But that's explained by the disposition and the initial state. So there's no mystery about the kind of innumerable things being exactly the same, right? It's because they're produced by a certain specified disposition at a certain point that you get them. Now, compare this view to yours at this stage, right? The starting point has a very simple thing characterized by very simple powers, and you can use it to explain everything that comes afterwards. However, it doesn't have God in it, right? You've got all of this too, if this is the right story of the universe. So your view will be more complicated than this one because it's got some extra ontology in it. And I mean, there's more to say, but that would be a way in which you can see that you could have a view that is entirely naturalistic and explains everything that's required to be explained, all the data, and is simpler than your view. Now, I said this was a toy example. It is a toy example because we're completely ignorant about the first part of the universe. We don't know really anything much at all about the period before inflation at this stage. There's lots of kind of dispute amongst cosmologists, but there's nothing close to anything like settled agreement. So it might turn out that the theory is going to be more complicated than the one I sketched, but it's not obvious that it has to be more complicated than the one that I sketched. And then it's not obvious that your argument from the kind of innumerably many particles is going to have any bite at all, right? So that's the kind of response that I wanted to make to that part of your argument.
Well, I'm afraid it is going to be more complicated. I grant you have just one object, as you do with mine, but it has to have some very special properties built into it if it's a physical thing. It has to be such as to cause the existence of other objects with very specific powers, and they have to have very specific powers to cause certain other objects with very specific powers. And these powers are the simple those powers which are equivalent to simple laws of nature and ones which produce us, our bodies. And there's a reason on my hypothesis why the laws should be like that. That is because we are a good thing. Now, on a naturalistic hypothesis, things don't act because of goodness. We do. That's how humans act. So it is, you have to build into the power of this simple initial state so much in detail to get this result, whereas I don't.
So I don't think that's right. I mean, it is. I mean, you might think that you had to build an awful lot into your initial state in order to get the stuff out as well. So that's one point. But put that to one side. There is a question about which we're probably going to disagree, about how you should think about modality, how you should think about necessity and probability. And I think that there's a kind of notion of metaphysical or ontological necessity and ontological modality that we should adopt. And the view that I like is one according to which the actual world really is the determinant of what's possible, right? So one way of thinking about it is you shouldn't suppose that there are more possibilities than the possibilities that you need in order to adequately characterize the actual world. What do you need? What possibilities do you need in order to characterize the actual world? Well, if, as you think, there's indeterministic causation, then you need possibilities for that. So what we should think is, now let's go to the metaphor of possible worlds. All possible worlds share some history with the actual world, diverge from it because chances play out differently, because indeterministic causation plays out differently. What lies behind this, in part, is a consideration about simplicity. You shouldn't multiply possibilities beyond necessity, right? It's the ontological scruple at work. But it's a consequence now of adopting this view that the initial state will be necessary and the laws will be necessary. And so now we have an explanation for the initial state. Why is it the way it is? Because it had to be. Why are the laws the way they are? Because they had to be. This just falls out of the best account of modality, according to me. So I don't agree with you that there's no explanation here. Right? And you can see that
there's no good explanation.
No, but it's a perfectly good explanation. If something is because it had to be, that's as good an explanation as
but the explanation that it had to be is meant to be as an explanation of why it is. And I don't think that. I think, of course, even if I agreed with you, the issue is what is the universe like? That is to say, does it include God or doesn't it include God? And it includes a lot of things we can't observe, which are postulated in order to explain ones we can. It includes all sorts of tiny little particles which no one can see because they provide the simplest explanation of what we can see. Therefore, we ought to suppose that the universe contains whatever is most probable to explain all the things that we observe. And that's the actual nature of the universe.
I don't see how that was inconsistent with anything that I said.
Oh, well, in that case, we're all right, aren't we? Because God comes back.
No, it doesn't, because we remember the overall methodology here is Bayesian. So we set out the hypotheses and then we assess them for simplicity. But it turns out that your view is more complicated than mine and doesn't explain the data any better, right? So
but it isn't
my
more
view is better.
Yeah. But entities are not to be postulated beyond necessity, or more accurately, entities are not to be postulated beyond entities which, if you postulate them, will give a simple explanation of many things. And God is just that. And I do stress that if you suppose that it's all a materialist thing, you really do need to explain why everything is set up so as to produce us. And there's a very simple reason on my account why that is so, because we are a good thing and have a sort of godness that God doesn't have, and that's a very good reason why God would produce us, because God, being omnipotent, it follows from his omnipotence that he will be perfectly good, because he will know, an omnipotent being will know of every possible action what its characteristics are, because otherwise he won't be able to produce these things. And he will know, therefore, what's good and what's bad. And to recognize something as good is to have the motivation for doing it. And so he has a motivation for doing it. But God, being the one thing and omnipotent, is not subject to any temptations to do evil as we are. So inevitably he will do the good. And that follows from his nature that he will do the good. Whereas you've got to build all this into the peculiar characteristics of your initial state.
It seems to me a gratuitous assumption to suppose that the universe is set up for us, right? Even on the Earth, there's a lot more different kinds of beetles than there are people, right? Remember Haldane's, the biologist's famous remark that the Lord seems to be inordinately fond of beetles. But equally, there's lots more stars. Maybe the universe is set up for stars, right? They're picking on us just seems completely gratuitous.
I didn't say
we're what the world is about.
You didn't say we're the only thing, or if I did, I didn't mean to. I said which mainly for us. Of course, the stars are good things. I mean, you just got to look at the night sky. It's a marvelous work of art. And plants and animals are good things. But we have a unique kind of goodness. That is to say, every other kind of goodness is a goodness which God himself has. Is it beautiful? God is beautiful. Is it conscious? God is conscious. Can it cause things? God can cause a lot more things. But one thing God can't do is to choose between good and evil. And so it's a very, yet that is a good thing to be able to affect the nature, in a small way, the nature of the universe. And that's a very good reason why God would make us.
So, do you think, here's a different question, which might be a little bit tangential, but do you think that there are other inhabited planets in the universe?
I don't know. There may be, yes, certainly. In which case, similar arguments apply. At least we'd need to know about their inhabitants and so on. But if their inhabitants were like us, well, he would have that little reason for producing them. But they might not be like us at all, in which case he would have less reason to produce them, but he might well do so. We have to go on the evidence we've got, and I'm just concerned with what we know. But it wouldn't count either way if as far as I'm concerned, if there are other inhabited by rational beings, that is.
So it could be, based on this last little bit of the conversation, that given the initial setup of the universe and given the initial powers of the initial setup, that it's more or less inevitable that there'll be creatures like us, or it might be that it's still actually rather unlikely that there would be creatures like us. I mean, it just depends how the chances play out. I'm not seeing any problem for the presence of human beings in the universe on the basis of the metaphysical model that I set out before. I don't see why you would think that it's it could be that it's just more or less certain that there's going to be something like people. So you imagine taking it, starting from the initial condition and just running it over and over. It might just turn out that always you end up with inhabited planets.
Yes, I'm not convinced of that because I don't think science has an explanation of consciousness. It just doesn't fit into the sort of science we know about. And until it can be shown that it follows from the nature of matter, that eventually, if it's arranged in a certain way, it will produce consciousness, only so would we have reason to believe that there would be other beings who are like us in this respect. But maybe that could be done. And in that case, if God has created a very big universe, then is quite likely there would be not merely life, but human-like life on other planets. And if he's got reason to produce us, he's got reason to produce them. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, you've now brought up consciousness, and in Is There a God? You dismiss the position that I like with a single sentence saying that it's absurdly unlikely to be right. It seems to me that that kind of identity theory, the view that the mental states and processes in organisms are just physical states and processes of those organisms, has a lot going for it. For a start, there's obviously it's favoured by considerations of simplicity in a way that no other theory of mind, except perhaps a kind of idealist theory, might be. But also, there's lots of reasons for thinking that it's kind of pretty obviously right. So I'm wondering whether you want to say a bit more about why, if you tethered the identity theory to the metaphysical sketch that I gave before, why you wouldn't conclude that you had even more reason to think that it explains all the data, but it's simpler.
Well, I think the identity theory is necessarily false, and deals with that. I mean...
Well, yes, but I think that the claim that God exists is necessarily false.
Do you want me to say
where that were enough, that would deal with it, right? So that's not going to get us anywhere. What we're supposed to be doing is comparing the theories and
but no,
a reasonable accounting of their simplicity and their explanatory.
That's a non-starter. Mind-brain identity theory. It really is a non-starter. Physical matter is the matter it is in virtue of having public properties. Publicly observable properties which are equally accessible to you and me and everybody else. And we learn what fundamentally they are, like their mass and size and charge and that sort of thing, but they manifest themselves in rather larger conglomerations, but that's what in essence they are. But our mental life of thought, feeling, intention, belief, desire, this is, we necessarily experience our own desires and thoughts and so on, and other people only have access to them of a contingent sort. We have necessary access to them. They wouldn't be existing unless they... If they're ours, necessarily we can know about them, but others necessarily only know about them contingently. They can put an apparatus on my head and find out what I'm thinking about, but it depends on the apparatus working perfectly, and maybe it won't if they're to get knowledge from it, but it doesn't depend on any apparatus working perfectly for me to know what I'm thinking about. There's a massive difference between the two kinds of properties which can't be identical.
So I think that you're kind of making an error there. So the important point about knowing what it's like is being in a certain kind of state yourself. And you can't be in anyone else's state. You can't have knowledge about what it's like to be in someone else's physical state. That's just impossible, right? And that's all that you're appealing to in the considerations that you just gave. Right?
You said
that point about the fact that knowing what it's like to be in a state really requires that you're in the state, right? So you can't see the world through my eyes, right? But that's got nothing to do with dualism or anything like that. It's got to do with the fact that my seeing is a matter of processing that's happening inside my head.
It's not. the problem would still arise, even if there, as it were, there was a person, or rather, even if some of me was replaced, some of my brain replaced some of your brain, and I could control your left hand and you could control my right hand, it wouldn't be a matter of, it's still the case that my thoughts would only be known to your thoughts indirectly. And indeed, there are cases of Siamese twins who are conjoined at the head, and each twin says, I know what you're thinking about, but they also say, I know it's you that's thinking about it and not me, and it's not a matter of the body that's in control. It's a matter of what you are thinking. You're thinking what you're thinking, whether or not you've got a body.
So that sounds disputable to me. I mean, that actual case. There's lots of very fanciful examples in philosophy of mind which just turn out to be impossible. And my best guess is that what you just described is not an accurate description of conjoined Siamese twins. And go back to the point that I made, right? So I'm in the Is There a God? You start talking about examples of brain bisection, but that's just fantasy. That's not something real.
I do not deny that. It is. We're coming towards that state. But it doesn't matter whether it's real or not. The point is, I know what I'm thinking about, and you will only know about it indirectly. I necessarily know about it.
Yeah, but that's
two sorts of properties.
Right, but that's just the point. That point is one that identity theorists can make too, right? Because you can't be in my physical state, right? You can't occupy. This is partly just a consequence of the fact that you can't have two things in the same place at the same time. You can't have my visual field because my visual field depends upon my being located exactly here, right? And the same point is going to apply to the rest of your mental life. You can know general things about it, but you can't know the particular stuff.
Could put on a special pair of glasses, which broadcast radio waves to me, and I could know exactly how it looks from your point of view.
No, because your brain's not set up the same way that mine is. There's all kinds of differences that are individual differences, right? You would have to, it wouldn't be enough just to kind of attach a camera. You'd have to alter the wiring in your brain in order to be able to have the experiences that I'm having.
Sorry to jump in. I would like, this is great conversation on
sorry.
Evacuation times as these
you need to mute.
Yeah. Sorry, I muted you for a second just to be sure, but I just wanted to say it would be great to continue on this on the philosophy of mind stuff, but maybe if you could bring it back to more the stuff related to theism more directly. So it sounded like Richard was making a kind of Bayesian argument based on fine-tuning for life and then for consciousness, and I don't know. It might, on the latter, it might be more relevant to talk about stuff on mind, but maybe if you could just bring it back to that, it'd be great, and then we could. Sorry.
So the tone hasn't gone off. I'm wondering how long it's going to be before it goes off. When it does go off, it'll be really loud. So,
okay.
So that's a bit awkward.
Attention. Testing of the building's evacuation system is now complete. Please treat all further evacuation tones as genuine. I repeat, testing of the building's evacuation system is now complete. Please treat all further evacuation tones as genuine. Thank you.
So obviously
hopefully that's it.
We didn't hear it in this part of the building. We've been going for over an hour, so it might be time soon to throw to the audience.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Richard. How are you doing? Are you?
No, I'm fine. Let's have the audience.
Sure. If we want to go to that, I have a bunch of questions saved already. But again, if people want to leave some chats, I'll still be looking through.
No, I think it's fair to the audience to let them in.
Yeah. So, a question earlier from Kozer, who was wondering specifically for Graham, if you were to accept that the physicalist or materialist view of the mind was false, would that increase the case for theism for you, or would it be more or less indifferent?
So, in the best argument against God, I suggest that it really doesn't make that much difference. I'm bearing in mind what Richard's likely to say. What you would have to think is that somehow or other you get the production of minds when you've got certain kinds of physically complex organisms by some kind of natural or metaphysically natural process. And there are people who hold views like that. I think that it's slightly more complicated, but it's not obvious that it's going to be so much more complicated that it would lead you to think that it's inevitable that theism is going to win over naturalism. So that's the short answer to that question.
All right, very good. And yeah, so a question for Richard from Majesty of Reason, who was wondering, yeah, plausibly God could have actualized the goods of conscious moral beings in innumerable ways. You mentioned Nielsen and Babu's innumerable ways, like many different ways than we actually observe. So in light of this, how well does theism predict the data that the world is as we observe it?
Well, it doesn't. What I said was a good thing, and what my account of God would lead us to expect that he would bring about is that, to be a little more precise, he would create what I call humanly free beings. That is to say, beings who are conscious, have free choices, limited free choices between good and evil, limited powers, limited knowledge, who can improve their powers, improve their knowledge, who can make difference to other people's powers and knowledge. It follows from that they need bodies, because a body is somewhere that you're pinned down to, and therefore other people can get hold of you in order to make a difference to you. And it's a limited area over which you can control the universe. If we were all spirits, how on earth would we get hold of each other against our will? And there isn't any way, because we would need to be tied down to some public way in order for others to be able to get hold of us. Now, I quite agree there are many other ways in which this could be done, in the sense that there could be different sorts of bodies, we could have different sorts of power, but I'm not wishing to predict all the details of humans. I'm just saying there would have to be these sort of beings, and my argument is an argument from the existence of beings of that kind. I mean, God could choose at will what sort of what they would be like, but what I need the hypothesis for is to explain that there are beings of this kind.
Yeah, did you want to comment on that, Graham?
So I thought I'd ask, I mean, this might seem slightly tangential, but I kind of thought I would ask Richard about what he thinks about theistic idealism at this point. I mean, surely, God could make it the case that there's just minds, so human minds and the divine mind, and then there's kind of signals going backwards and forwards, particularly lots of inputs from God to the minds, that enable the minds to influence one another, so that you don't, it's not obvious that the kind of bodily thing is going to be something that God's bound to, but that's the kind of only solution.
Yes, you'd need certain, I mean, you'd need to be able to get hold of people against their will. Otherwise, you couldn't make a difference.
Right, but you could on this view. Right.
Yes, I'm not ruling out that view. I'm just saying it would have to be made very specific in the sense that whether it's made out of matter or whether it's got a computer address, email address that we can't avoid, and that is what makes it a body. It's some sort of location where we can get hold of, where we therefore act from, because other people can affect our actions, and from which we see the world. And I agree there could be other ways in which this could be done, sure. But my point is, in most other universes, it couldn't be done at all.
All right, I'll move on to the next question. Let's see. Yeah, I had one from T. Torchon, who was wondering, how does Richard respond to the problem of the priors, right? Is this not a problem for Bayesian analysis of this sort? And yeah, maybe Graham can come in on that too.
Sure. And the answer is, how do scientists deal with the problem of the priors? Because we think that some scientific theories are probably true, and we think this is an objective matter. It's not a matter of just some scientist liking to think it's true. It's not and that can only be, there can only be objective criteria for scientific truth if there are objective criteria for priors. My account of these objective criteria for priors is that the basic criterion is the criterion of simplicity. A theory is simpler insofar as it postulates few entities, few kinds of entities, few properties, few kinds of properties, mathematically simple relations between them. By that I mean one relation or one number is simpler than another relation or number if you can know the first without knowing the second, but not vice versa. I mean, I can know what 3 is without knowing what 6 is, but I can't know what 6 is without knowing what 3 is. And so ad inf. And I can know what 0 is without knowing what 2 to the 21st is, and 0 is indeed a very simple number indeed. So yes, there are these criteria, and scientists use them. They're not very conscious of using them, but they do, and they would certainly rule out hypotheses that postulated entities beyond necessity, in other words, beyond the necessity in order to explain certain things. They would certainly rule out theories that postulate properties beyond necessity. And they certainly prefer a simple mathematical relation to a complicated one. They do use them, and I'm just using the same ones to assess priors. Of course, we can't give exact values to priors. I can't say but we can't do that in science either. I can't say the prior probability of quantum theory is 0.32, but I can say the prior probability of quantum theory is a great deal greater than such and such a theory, or than less than such and such a theory. And that's all I need.
So there's, I mean, obviously there's enormous disputes in philosophy of science about Bayesianism, whether if you're going to be a Bayesian, you should be a subjective Bayesian or an objective Bayesian. And most people think that there are lots of difficulties in being an objective Bayesian. And some of the people who are subjective Bayesians think, well, it doesn't really matter. So long as your priors are not crazy. So long as you get enough data, there's these sort of long run convergence results. You'll end up getting to the right conclusion. There are lots of people who think something closer to the last thing that you said, that which wasn't quite this, but was close to it, that we can do comparisons. We can say this is more sort of the prior probability of this is higher than that without assigning any numbers. Because if we're going to do theory choice, maybe we don't. I mean, there's certainly in special conditions you don't need to actually assign numbers at all in something that looks very much like a Bayesian framework. So I suppose, just to give you the sort of thought that I've got in mind, you've got two hypotheses and you agree that one of them's got a higher prior probability because it's simpler, and then you've got a partitioning on the data, and on every bit of the data, the one that's the more likely one is giving better explanations than the one that isn't. Well, now we can just conclude, right, that the first theory is better than the second on all of the evidence without numbers coming into it at all. In some sense, that's still Bayesian, you might think, or maybe you don't think that's Bayesian, but it's kind of near enough.
Yep, that's all you need, comparative, but you do need actually not merely the notion of greater than, but the notion of much greater than. But given that, yes, that is all you need. Because I want to say my hypothesis is a lot simpler, not just simpler, but a lot simpler than these rival ones, and therefore simpler than the disjunction of these rival ones. That's how you deal with priors. You did mention the point that, of course, in what you might call low-level science, evidence is turning up all the time, and therefore, even if you can't judge between quite a number of theories on prior probability grounds, evidence will turn up to knock one or two of them out and leave the rest. But the most general features of the universe aren't going to change much. We're not going to have vast amounts of new evidence. So it's got to be prior. You've got to do a lot of work with priors, but that's no problem because there are other sciences in which that is also the case. Often in astronomy, you have to wait for evidence and it may not turn up. But in life, we have to make decisions at the time, and if there are a number of theories which we can't decide between on the basis of one makes predictions, the other doesn't, we've got to decide between them on relative simplicity. I mean, if we've got to decide between a theory that says the Western Hemisphere is going to be blown up tomorrow, and the other one says the Eastern Hemisphere is going to be blown up tomorrow, or should I say that the Northern is going to be blown up tomorrow, and the other one says the Southern is going to be blown up tomorrow, and they both make the same predictions, but one is simpler than another. That's the only way to choose between them. And we can't wait for further evidence. We want to get on a plane to get to the right hemisphere. So, and I mean, that's in a sense a silly example, but it's not. There are more real life ones. I mean, when the first atomic bomb was tested, nobody knew for certain what would happen. But their theory, which they thought was the best theory of data so far, predicted that there wouldn't be an explosion that that you couldn't stop and would blow the whole world up. But their grounds would only be that it was a simple theory.
All right. Do you want to move through a few more questions before we finish off? So show this on screen. Question from Converse Contender. He's wondering if, Richard, if you think that God has middle knowledge, or if you accept any sort of Molinism.
No, I don't. think God has middle knowledge. I am what is called an open theist, though I was an open theist before the name was invented. That is to say, I think God does not necessarily know what we will do freely tomorrow. That is the result of God's own choice to give us that sort of freedom, and he could withdraw it at any time, and I don't think all our actions are free. But some of them are, and if so far as they are, God does not know for certain what we will do. And hypotheses that try and get round it by such devices as middle knowledge, that is to say, God, it consists in God, in effect, choosing between universes in which we do this and allegedly freely, and universes in which we do that allegedly freely. I don't see God can have that choice because he doesn't know what sort of universe he would have to make in order for it to be a universe in which we choose freely or don't choose freely. So, no, I'm not sympathetic to middle knowledge.
All right, fair enough. And then another one from Capturing Christianity, who's wondering, also for Swinburne, what do you make of Oppy's view of modality? Necessary starting point, branching based on chanciness and so on.
Well, I don't agree with them, but I don't think it's necessarily going to make a difference to this, as Graham Oppy pointed out. I do think that the basic concept of modality is to be analysed in terms of conceivability. That is to say, there are all sorts of alternative universes which we can understand what it would be like for them to be true, and they are logically possible universes. And ultimately, the notion of metaphysical possibility can be analysed in terms of logical possibility. Yeah. And you want me to go on this, or it'll take us into a very area.
Maybe.
Can I just briefly say something?
Yes.
So I think that there's metaphysical modality, and then there's something more like doxastic modality. There's the what could a reasonable person reasonably believe. These are just different things. One of them, I mean, the metaphysical one has to do with what there is. The other one has to do with things like measuring our ignorance, right? And you shouldn't suppose that there's any metaphysical consequences that attach to our ignorance, right? So unlike Richard, I don't think that there's any explanation of metaphysical modality in terms of our ignorance.
I think we better have another question. That I have complicated views about modality, I think.
Yeah, there was one from someone who was wondering, I'll show it on the screen, I suppose, from Jake, who's wondering, can Dr. Swinburne explain and perhaps defend briefly, I suppose, since we're coming up on the time, your view on God's necessity or lack thereof?
Yes, I am puzzled about that. I don't think it's metaphysically necessary that there is a God because, rather, I don't think it's metaphysically necessary in the kind of way in which metaphysical necessity has become fashionable these days. That is to say, in the sense in which it's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O and so on, because that's the underlying essence of it. I don't think it will be an underlying essence of God that he is a necessary being, because the only way, I'm going to go back on that in a minute, the only way in which I can understand the sort of water H2O way will involve reference to logical necessity, and I don't think it's logically possible that there is a logically necessary being. But there must be a sense in which the ultimate cause of things, whether it's God or the universe, is the ultimate brute fact of the world. And it's a not unreasonable notion of necessity to say that what is the ultimate thing on which everything else depends and doesn't have an explanation itself, not merely we can't explain it, but it doesn't have one, is ontologically necessary. And that is what I basically want to say. I mean, he has the same sort of necessity as, if there were no God, the universe would have.
Right, so that was just the point I was going to make. Your notion of what you're calling ontological necessity is rather like what I call metaphysical necessity, and you distinguished it from logical necessity. So maybe there's not that much difference between us after all.
Well, yeah, but you also think there's other sorts of metaphysical necessity. But yeah.
Well, I think that the laws, or the powers, but presumably you do too, right? You think that it's essential to God that God's omnipotent and perfectly free, and
yes.
That will turn out to be ontological necessity as well, on your view.
Oh no, it's what God is. What is ontologically necessary is that there is a being of this kind
that has those powers, right? So
yeah, sure.
But that's fine then. That really does mean that the difference between your view and mine
in
is
the case of God, you can't separate him from his powers. I mean, our powers may come and go, but his powers are part of what makes him who he is.
Right, but then if take the water H2O example, what makes water what it is its constitution.
Yeah, sure.
Molecules. And so there will be things about us that are like that, right? It's just
yes, I agree.
All right, so we're coming up on the time. I did want to get one more question in, which I thought was pretty good here. So Jack Eastling asked, if we consider ontological simplicity, naturalism is clearly simpler, since theism posits a God while naturalism doesn't. So in what sense is theism simpler? I mean, it seems to me like it comes back to Graham's point, which is that on your theory, Richard, you're agreeing that there's a natural world of a certain sort, but also positing a God that plays a certain role and has certain attributes. And that seems, if it's not adding explanatory benefit, that it's odious. It's not really a better theory. I think that's...
My answer is that the role of simplicity is that simplicity is only one of the three criteria I mentioned for the probable truth of a scientific theory. And the simplest among theories which are such as to lead you to expect the data, which you wouldn't otherwise expect, those are the simple theories. A theory which says that the mind is the same as the body is I think logically impossible, and therefore ruled out on those simple grounds. And it couldn't explain anything because it makes no sense. If naturalism can lead one to explain certain things without postulating God, then if I can produce a simpler theory which can explain those things, then that is grounds for believing it to be true, even if it does involve adding another kind of entity. I mean, that is the way that science has always progressed. You postulate entities, often entities of a kind of which you cannot observe observable cases, in order to explain the observable phenomena. I mean, nobody's ever seen something that's both a wave and a particle, but you don't find them round you. But you postulate that fundamental particles have this property because it best explains the properties that the observable things do have. And adding an extra kind of entity, if thereby you can explain what otherwise would be a lot of separate things, is a very good reason for adding it.
Did you want to make a comment on that, Graham? Or?
I think that we've already kind of been over that ground, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, fair enough. I think that's probably going to be, we agreed to about 90 minutes, so I think we're about at the end now. Thanks everyone for the questions that you asked. There's some really good ones in there. And thanks for watching, everybody. And thanks so much to Professor Richard Swinburne and Graham Oppy for being here. It's been an absolute treat. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
So can I just add thanks to the people who asked questions, and special thanks to Richard for staying up late.
Sorry?
I just said thank you for staying up late.
Thank you. I hope you have a nice day. It's my bedtime.
All right, we'll end it there. Thanks everyone for watching. Maybe consider subscribing if you like this, and yeah, I'll see you. I might have an after party stream for anyone who wants to come and talk about this, but we'll end it there. Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay, well, good night, everybody, and thanks very much. Yeah.
See you, Richard.
Yeah, bye. Thank you.